the paper that I'm going to report from is a first go really at pulling together from the findings from an empirical study that was funded by the N8 Policing Research Partnership that looked at the role of the sex work liaison officer in West Yorkshire Police. And this officer she's one of the few sex work liaison officers that are full-time in England at the moment, but there is a bit of a history of those types of officers. But what those officers are really aimed at doing is trying to bridge this tension between care and control in the policing of sex workers. So sex work is the police are in a dual role, so they enforce laws against soliciting and organising sex work, but they also have a duty of protection to victims of crime. So there's kind of two strands of findings, I think, and one is the sex work specific findings, and then two is more generic insights about how new models for vulnerability policing are operationalised by police and policing partners, and also how these are received by supposedly vulnerable citizens. So again, what Harriet was saying about how the receiving of interventions is quite different, quite often seen differently to the way that professionals see them. I think this paper touches on that too. So this study was building on work looking at how vulnerability is operationalised, and I've been doing that for a while now. So really looking at the rise of vulnerability in social policy in the UK and internationally, in areas like housing, social care, immigration, children and young people services, but more latterly, how this rise has come into criminal justice arenas. So in terms of the vulnerable victim, as you said, Sam, but also the needy offender. And you really see that the victim and offender binary vulnerability kind of starts to problematize that, and I'm quite interested in that, particularly kind of care and control. And also I'm really interested, it really came out in Di's presentation about this idea of what you might call penal welfareism. So about when the enforcement arm of the state is kind and supportive, and what that means for society, but also what it means for vulnerable citizens and their rights and safety and justice. And that's what we're really trying to look at in this paper. Vulnerability is not clearly operationalised, and Laura's told us about that really well. And I think that means that it's interesting because you get to see the different ways in which agendas are operating, and they're all kind of muddled in together often in the operation of vulnerability interventions. And just to add that this isn't just a UK phenomenon that we're seeing. We've got scholars writing in Australia about the rise of vulnerability-based policing, and then there's a really good paper as well about sentencing and vulnerability, Costa Rica and the UK, and that's worth a look if you're into international dimensions. So it's really important to set the context for the study in terms of sex work and vulnerability, but we... Oh, have I got that? That's are you seeing the slide? Sorry, I don't know which slide you're seeing. So are you seeing now Laura's slide on the College of Policing's aid to vulnerability policing? Yes. Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. We could talk about this if we had time, but you see there that age, gender, disability are personal factors in this operationalisation, but I think as researchers we'd probably be saying things like that they're structural factors, and that touches on your point, Sam, about how, for example, if you think about young black men, for example, how they, if their ethnicity is seen as a personal factor rather than a structural factor, what that then means for interventions. So in terms of sex work is almost like a classic vulnerable group as identified in policy terms, and in that paper that you mentioned, Sammy, and Tila Sanders explore this. And usually that's a way of foregrounding the experiences of female street sex workers, which is what the criminal justice system mainly focuses on in terms of response to sex work. And I'm not going to get a chance to go through the actual vulnerabilities of sex workers, but that slide there kind of gives an introduction to that for anyone who's interested. I think a really key factor is that sex workers are reluctant to report violence, usually for fear of prosecution from soliciting, and for maybe not being taken seriously. So they're in this catch-22 where they're often victims of crime, or have experienced victims of crime, and then also simultaneously put in a position where they're offending under the law. So we know from decades of work all around the world that policing is a key factor in sex workers' vulnerability. The more oppressive the policing, the more at risk sex workers will be, less likely to come forward. And that also varies according to different sectors. So whether it's street, parlour or online, and then it also varies according to gender, ethnicity, migration status, and that's been really well covered. There's a really rich literature on that. I think the key context for the study is that online is the biggest sector by far, but street sex work is traditionally the focus of criminal justice, where police are spending lots of time on antisocial behaviour, what they classified as antisocial behaviour, but where deeper vulnerabilities are unchanged. In terms of volume of crime and acute risk, you actually see in the sex work literature that indoor sex workers are probably equally as vulnerable to crime. And if you look at, for example, the homicide rates, there are increasing numbers of indoor migrant sex workers who are being targeted, and their vulnerabilities targeted by people who then commit homicides against them, and an alarming rate towards indoor migrant sex workers being the most murdered group. So actually the policing approaches don't necessarily match the real vulnerabilities of sex workers, but and that's the context really for the introduction of the sex work liaison officer role. So this is a role that is it's seen as, it's kind of benchmarked as best practice, and it's been put forward as one of a range of tools that the NPCC recommends can be implemented in order to try and approach sex work from a position that seeks to address vulnerability and exploitation rather than enforcement. So it's a protection-based model, and there's a long history of these types of models, and the sex work liaison officers were introduced in the 90s in the context of vice squads, but they have fluctuated often in terms of what resources are available actually, and so they pop up in different areas, are utilised for a while. Leeds is one of the West Yorkshire Police is one of the few forces to have a full-time dedicated sex work liaison officer in place for a number of years, and to the context for that officer is a managed approach to street sex work, which I won't go into today because it's quite it's a controversial intervention in its own right. So I am prepared to speak about it if anybody wants to know more about it. But I think in terms of the context for this project, I think what you tend to see is that the officer is bound up in some of the interventions with street sex work, but it's a citywide remit, and the street sex work area is quite a small proportion of the sex work in Leeds, but tends to dominate the work of the sex work liaison officer role. So the methods that we used, oh, that's the managed area. So that's where some of the a lot of the sex work liaison officers role will be. Looks a bit different to how the Daily Mail reports it. That's all I'll say on the managed area. The methods that we used, we ended up doing quite a large study here on quite a small budget. So we had 20 stakeholder interviews, 3 focus groups, and they were with police and police partners, community representatives, kind of professional roles. And then we had upwards of 30 sex workers who were also involved in the study in various ways. So we did interviews with sex workers, indoor and outdoor, from different ethnicities, including migrant sex workers, 2 Romanian women. And this was supplemented by ethnographic insights, diary keeping, shadowing the officer. So quite a mix of ethnographic work, but also we looked at the data, the crime data for West Yorkshire Police that was attached to the officer. And we also looked at the specialist reporting scheme for sex workers, which is called National Ugly Mugs. And we tried to piece together the work of the sex work liaison officer through that mixed methods approach. The study was co-produced with sex workers in terms of, so it wasn't co-produced in the way that Harriet's was, really, with kind of centering sex workers, but we only had a year to do the research, so we tried to involve sex workers as much as we could within the constraints of the budget and the time. So the participatory approach is mainly centered around focus groups, designing tools, and then focus groups on the analysis. And we did that with online sex workers from around the country, and also focus groups with and arts workshops with street sex workers that were more like drop-ins, and then focus groups with an advocacy group called Swarm, Sex Worker Advocacy and Resistance Movement. And so they fed in at both the kind of the development of tools and the analysis stage. We were supported by local partners, mainly Basis Yorkshire. It inputted a huge amount of resources into supporting us, and sex workers were paid for their time and expertise. So on to the findings. These are kind of the policing findings that relate to sex work, really. So what we tried to do was develop some kind of profile, almost research-based profile that we can work up to help forces to develop these kind of roles. So this slide really details what the purpose and job description of the officer tends to involve, with you know, things that will probably be really familiar to most of you. So being a first point of contact for liaison work around sex work, crimes committed against sex workers, and then supporting investigations. Engagement work was massive, and being an advocate within the force, actually, for justice for sex workers. And her role did also involve enforcement action as well as support. So she would be involved in rule breaches of the managed area, for example, where sex workers were not operating in line with the rules of the managed area. She would be brought in into that the enforcement action associated with that, and she'd also be responding to community concerns, which again might be with community concerns might sometimes be about demanding enforcement action is taken against people who are perceived as offenders in that context. So some of the challenges there are about how to ensure that vulnerability is the real focus. So the role's designed to be a protection-based approach, but how far is that a reality? And sustainability, I think, is a key issue where you've got a lot of expertise concentrated with a specialist officer, and how that might play out in the wider force. So these were some of the arts workshops that the sex workers developed a set of resources which highlight some of the key messages, and that's one of the posters that they came up with about what makes a good sex work liaison officer. Okay, so the next thing that we explored was about justice for sex workers. Does this post enhance justice for sex workers? Well, there was an absolute raft of positive reports of engagement and trust building that really were difficult to overstate. They were immensely important to many of the sex workers that we spoke to. All the sex workers that we spoke to were women sex workers, because the sex work liaison officer works with women only. So these are quotes from the range of women that we spoke to. So I won't read them all out, but probably the last one, saying 30 years of my life I've hated the police, and she's changed my perspective on the police. I was brought up in a family that didn't like them. She's changed my perspective on what I think, and I think the police are amazing now because of the sex work liaison officer. So some high praise in certain arenas. The migrant sex worker saying, I would never have reported a crime before I met her, and now I know what to do and I will report a crime. So amongst the most vulnerable sex workers, they're saying that it really makes a difference to them. In terms of mitigation of vulnerability, there was also some evidence that women felt safer, directly safer. So not just more reporting, but felt safer. Oh, sorry, I meant to say that there was also in the statistics evidence of increased reporting. So in the specialist reporting system, no sex workers gave permission to share details with police in 2012. But then with the introduction of the managed approach and the liaison officer, that was up to 50% saying, yes, we'll share details with the police. And then that tailed off recently, but we think that that was administrative rather than actual, because we think those reports were being made to the police with permission, but weren't being logged as that. But we don't know. I need to kind of follow that up. So, yeah, and we think that there was evidence that women felt safer. So, but that was mixed. So I'd feel more safe if there were more police liaison officers, says Beth there. And then one sex worker there saying, giving a graphic account of an assault, and saying that in the middle of the assault, she screamed that she would get the liaison officer on the perpetrator. And she said that that stopped the assault. So some quite compelling evidence. And then a migrant sex worker there saying, I feel safer around because I know her than when I work in other locations. But having said that, there were these considerable barriers to reporting which remain. So some sex workers, particularly those we saw in the arts workshop, who didn't come forward for interviews, were saying, I'd never report to any of the police. And then I think most importantly, when we looked at what makes a good outcome under the criminal justice system and whether sex workers were getting good outcomes as a result of the reports, we found quite a concerning picture. So they were coming forward and building trust with the sex work liaison officer, but then in most of the crime reports, 86% of the 78 cases we could track, there was no further action. So as sex workers entered into the mainstream criminal justice system or into the specialist justice system, most of the time that wasn't being the cases weren't being taken forward, and this was a major source of pain and frustration for sex workers. This kind of summed it up. You hand them the criminals and the criminals go free. Where's the justice in that? And there were countless stories of sex workers investing in the reporting of the crime to be bitterly disappointed about how it was then taken forward. So this was one of the posters that sex workers developed, which seemed to sum that up. It feels like because we're working, we don't deserve justice. That message is writ large over all the sex work research for decades. So I think, Di, you said you wanted to get beyond revolving door policing, and that was an expression that Joe Phoenix used in a paper about sex work when the ASBO policing was in fashion. And I think this post really moves beyond that, and we had some evidence of that. So the top quote is about 18 months after outreach work where the officer had made contact with the migrant sex worker when she was going around visiting the parlours. The woman came forward as a victim of trafficking and entered the national referral mechanism. So she was taken to another part of the country, and then she was assisting with a criminal investigation into human trafficking. And that was after a visit and a business card. And that's something that the officer does every 2 weeks with the partner agency Basis Yorkshire. The second quote is about there had been some amazing outcomes, a small number of outcomes where sex workers had got justice in the criminal justice system. So there'd been rape convictions, which I think was unthinkable before that. And this is someone from the serious and complex crime investigation team saying that we couldn't just do our investigation, we can't just pitch up and do one. It's the relationship of the sex work liaison officer which allowed us to be able to do our investigation. So I spoke with her, she knew her, she developed a relationship with her and her care workers. The investigation ended up taking over 2 years because we identified a suspect. And he said at the end of that interview that he's had no doubt that it was the work of the sex work liaison officer that resulted in the conviction, and that without her they'd never have got that conviction. So there was a small number of cases which had got the outcome where the officer was really key. Then there was this issue of targeted and universal policing. So there was a much larger sex industry than the officer can service. So actually where she was mainly focusing her work was on the crimes reported by outdoor sex workers, and then outreach work with indoor that then sometimes led to some investigations. But actually indoor sex workers didn't have the level of engagement as outdoor, and male sex workers weren't in the arena for her remit. So that again speaks to some of the questions that Sam and Laura raised about gender and where resources end up being targeted in efforts to address vulnerability. I think this poster is kind of sums up one of the main challenges of the role. So this reads as really positive. If something had happened, I wouldn't feel like I could call 999. I wouldn't explain the full story. I'd be more likely to report to a specialist officer because I see them as an advocate instead of fearing stigma. But actually what we also saw, although the relationship was helpful for building trust, we also saw missed investigation windows. So sex workers saying, I wouldn't walk into West Yorkshire Police and I wouldn't ring 999. I'd wait until I saw the sex work liaison officer, and that had happened, and forensic windows had been missed as a result. So coming to an end, I've even gone over the time, even though I've tried to do it super speedily, so I'm sorry. The findings of care and control is probably the bit of the paper that speaks most to the collective interest in the panel. And I think a couple of examples of the blend of care and control being of significant magnitude for people's lives was that part of the officer's work was to, when she was doing the visits at the saunas and massage parlours indoors, she was taking pictures of migrant sex workers' identification cards. And that was helping. The justification was that if anything happened to the migrant sex workers, then there would be, the policing response was much easier if there was a photo, and it could result in much better investigatory outcomes. But I think that met with merely mixed feelings from sex workers, and there's a real ethical dilemma where, well, when the sex work liaison officer isn't in charge of what's done with that data, in the context of some of the hostile environment policies that are pursued in immigration, what does that caring approach dovetail with in terms of surveillance and potential for social control? I think the other thing that I alluded to earlier is about where the enforcement, the support is always in the context of enforcement. So we had more enforcement of the managed area rules during the time that we were doing the study. One sex worker relayed not reporting a crime outside the designated area because she feared arrest. So actually it didn't matter how good the rapport was with the sex work liaison officer. If she was working outside the rules, she wasn't afforded protection and justice because she was still in breach of an enforcement structure that made her vulnerable to crime. So yeah, in the discussion, I think you can really see this role as a vital hub for crimes against sex workers, but is bringing, I would have liked to kind of hear what people say about this, is bringing more crimes into the system ethical when over-policed groups such as sex workers are still so badly failed by the rest of their journey through the criminal justice system. And then questions about who gets the Rolls-Royce service. So intersectional analysis really of vulnerability, saying, well, actually, is it working well for particular groups in a gendered or a race or a class way, and less well for other groups? In this case, indoor male sex workers weren't very well served by the role. And I think the adversarial relationship remained and wasn't fundamentally addressed by this role. So sex workers were still criminalised, they were still stigmatised, they were still not ideal victims in the system. And I think that the case for more fundamental legal reform remains. I think in terms of the implications of compassionate policing, I think you can really see that as a theme in our talk. So does it soften the brutality of what Louis Leconte calls the centaur state, you know, the authoritarianism that we've seen rising in relation to vulnerable populations? Does it soften that? Or does the enforcement arm of the state doing that work actually undermine its legitimacy? So for residents, they were saying, well, why are you being nice to some of the residents saying, well, why are you being kind to sex workers? They're not obeying the law in the area in the way that they're supposed to. And I think the kind of role of the public in shaping the vulnerability agenda is interesting there. And I think there's another question really kind of which underpins most of my work about how does these types of caring interventions embed a penal welfare in a way that's harmful to vulnerable citizens. So at a time where we are withdrawing prevention and early intervention overall in the state, we're closing Sure Start centres, where welfare services are increasingly targeted on the most vulnerable, the most in need, but the criminal justice system, because it can't do anything else, as Laura's and Di's presentation showed, is reorientating towards the very thing that the welfare services are withdrawing from. So I think what you're potentially seeing is what Anna Alberti wrote, amazing paper that was in the last issue of the Criminology Journal about the immigration policing. She argues that we're seeing these profound changes at the heart of the state, actually, in the policing of vulnerability. And I think I would probably argue that these care approaches make really important incremental differences in the lives of vulnerable people. But actually, if you substitute these approaches for rights-based welfare work, then actually what we're doing is bolstering surveillance and social control of the most vulnerable in society. Okay, that's the